But I'll hand back over to my co-chair Susie now to introduce our final speaker.
Thanks very much, Lauren. So it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, and she is Angeline Munzara, who is the Livelihood Senior External Engagement Advisor and Savings for Transformation Project Model Manager for World Vision International. She has over 15 years of development experience working with non-governmental organizations at the national in Zimbabwe, regional in the SADC regions, and international levels in Geneva. Angeline is also the global chair for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization's International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture Compliance Committee. In this presentation, Angeline will discuss evidence from a recent World Vision report based on surveys across 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which confirmed alarming predictions of increased child poverty and hunger due to the economic impact of COVID-19. So I'll pass over to Angeline. Thank you, Angeline.
Thank you so much for such an introduction. So I'm also based in Johannesburg in South Africa. Just a disclaimer that I'm not an academia, I'm not a researcher, so it's really a great pleasure to be speaking amongst doctors and professors who are knowledgeable in this subject. But coming from a child-focused organization from World Vision International, we mainly work with children and the most vulnerable families who are in the hard to reach places, those who are mostly left behind in the fragile context, in the places where there are no government social protection measures reaching them. So we really, try to reach those communities because we take a child rights lens by protecting and supporting these families. We have the rights of children at the center of our strategy. So I guess I have a hard job of trying to keep everyone awake, being the last speaker for today, but it is a pleasure for me to share with you what is happening on the ground based on the rapid assessments that World Vision has undertaken, not only in the Africa region, but also in Asia and Latin America. But I'm going to focus more on the impacts of children, what we have found from our out of time COVID-19 aftershocks reports on ending child poverty and reducing inequalities in Africa by 2030. So we all know that whilst COVID-19 began as a health crisis, the most serious knock-on effect is loss of income and reduced access to food for the most vulnerable children and their families. And children who are living in already vulnerable and fragile contexts, not only across Africa, but also in the Asia and America region, are now facing the prospect of eating less food, risking children having to go out to work, to beg, or in some cases, even to be married off early, as parents and caregivers resort to negative coping mechanisms. So without the immediate action to protect people's livelihoods now, the impact of this pandemic will reverse the progress that has already been made towards the post-2030 agenda and irreparably damage the lives of current and future generations of children. In particular, the following efforts are hindered. SDG 1 on ending poverty as households lose their income. SDG 2 on ending hunger and malnutrition as families can no longer afford nutritious meals and 3 meals a day for their children. SDG 5 on promoting gender equality and social inclusion to reduce gender-based violence resulting from extreme poverty. And SDG 8.7 looking at ending child labor as parents do send some of their children off to work in order to supplement their household income. And then SDG 10 on efforts to reduce household inequalities as women who are mostly informal traders were affected by lockdown restrictions, and SDG 16 efforts to ending child marriage and all forms of violence against children. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So the COVID-19 crisis has actually exacerbated existing inequalities, affecting mostly those already deprived and marginalized. And the numbers are terrifying. what we have seen from the rapid assessments we carried out in 24 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, it projects that approximately 110 million children could go hungry, with 8 million children being pushed into child labor and begging. And this situation is dire for children who are living in the fragile and hard to reach places dependent on school feeding programs. So as you can see from the map, this map is from the World Food Program. We see that most of the school feeding programs are in Africa, and over 368 million children have been missing on meals globally, of which 48% are girls. And communities in sub-Saharan Africa that were already lacking sufficient and nutritious food before the outbreak are the worst hit by the pandemic. Already an estimated 20 million people have been living without enough food, and over 13.6 million in the Democratic Republic of Congo have already been receiving humanitarian assistance before they were hit by COVID-19. And this situation, we see that in Africa, was made worse by the presence of huge swarms of desert locusts that results in dramatic crop loss in parts of Ethiopia, in Kenya, and Somalia. And we read that most of these parts within the region experienced flooding. And we also witnessed in the continent the resurgence of Ebola in DRC, further complicating the COVID-19 response as the country experienced double jeopardy. As a result, there are now growing fears that up to 85 million more girls and boys worldwide may be exposed to physical, sexual, or emotional violence over 3 months as a result of the lockdown and the travel restrictions. We do have more information in our report that is available online called The Perfect Storm. So if you go on our website, you will be able to see this report with, scary findings about children who will be exposed to different forms of violence. Can you go to the next slide? So now we do have growing fears of repeat of history. What we have seen happening during the Ebola outbreak and the research that was done, we found out that 70% of female small-scale traders in Liberia, for example, lost their income, which affected their ability to provide their children's basic needs. And to make ends meet, some families sadly resorted to negative coping mechanisms to reduce their household financial burdens. And this in turn caused spikes in child abuse and sexual exploitation, enforced marriages, adolescent pregnancy, child labor, and other various forms of violence against children, especially girls. And I have read from interview that was done by FAO and the World Food Program that during the Ebola crisis, we witnessed what is currently going on right now is some families were only eating 1 meal per day instead of 2 to 3 meals, as was the norm before the Ebola outbreak. And we are seeing that the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 is presenting the similar challenges to these most vulnerable children and their families. And the key message that we have is that we are out of time to address these impacts and urgent action is required. And we clearly see here that when we're looking at children's rights and referencing Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of Children, we see that the capabilities of parents and caregivers to be able to provide the basic needs of their children is being inhibited because this article calls on states and parents and others responsible for the child to have the primary responsibility to secure within their abilities and financial capacities the conditions of living necessary for the child's development. But COVID-19 is actually curtailing this ability of caregivers, of parents to meet the basic needs of their children. And as poor families lose their income and livelihoods due to the pandemic, the world is edging itself closer to another global food crisis, which will hit the world's most vulnerable children the most. Can we go on to the 4th slide, please? So going on to the rapid assessments that we did in collaboration with our microfinance arm Vision Fund in Africa, we actually undertook a rapid assessment of the programs that we run, particularly on microfinance and savings for transformation groups, because we do run savings groups in most of the African countries, of whom 80% are women who are looking after over 500,000 children. So in Africa, we see that micro and small and medium enterprises are actually the backbone of economic growth, and are by far the largest employers in low-income countries, accounting for between 80 to 90% of employment. And most informal traders are actually women in the African context. But before the crisis, these small and medium enterprise owners were facing already a global credit gap of over 5.2 trillion. Most of the countries in Africa, if you look, for example, in the Mano River Basin, they've been battling with the Ebola outbreak, and by the time they're trying to revive their economies, COVID-19, hit. So they are faced with a double jeopardy whilst, trying to recover from conflict, from Ebola, then another additional pandemic, comes. So they're actually facing a tripartite crisis. And so Vision Fund conducted an analysis of 8 countries across the Africa region, in DRC, in Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia, and interviewed over 2,400 micro-entrepreneur clients, who revealed that 90% of those who were surveyed running small businesses are actually facing reduced income, affecting their loan repayment capacity. And 52% of these clients reported reduced demand for their services, whilst 36% said that their usual customers could no longer afford the services offered. And the analysis also found out that 80% of women who are in the small businesses and involved in informal trading, who are also part of the savings group. So the savings groups is when people, come together to pool their resources and saving on a monthly basis, and use this pool as a way to, to get small loans to fund their livelihood opportunities. So they were affected, and some of them could not even continue saving. And these informal traders now risk losing both their savings and income generating activities, with potentially devastating impacts on their children. Can you go to the 5th slide, please? And in particular, as an organization that works, as I said, with the most vulnerable in the fragile contexts and the hard to reach, we all did surveyed our programs in the within the refugee context. So we are running a saving group microfinance project within the host communities and refugees in the West Nile, Uganda. And we found some startling findings there. 10% of members had already sold their productive assets, and 47% were suffering large reductions in income, whilst 11% had no income at all. And what we have seen is that the well-being of children in these families, often more than 6 per household, are at major risk and require immediate assistance. And if we read reports, we are also aware that almost 40% of girls in Uganda are married off before their 18th birthday, and 1 in 10 is married before the age of 15. And according to UNICEF, Uganda has the 16th highest prevalence rate of child marriage in the world, and the 10th highest absolute number of child brides globally. So poverty or extreme poverty could actually expose more girls in this region, to child marriage. And UNICEF also reports that the prevalence of child marriages is actually estimated at 50% in West Nile. And these are really, scary figures. That's why we are saying that we are out of time, and something needs to be done in order to accelerate, the implementation of what works in order to lift the most vulnerable families and their children out of poverty if we are going to achieve the post-2030 agenda. So we have another decade to go. So moving on to my 6th slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about scaling up what works. So as we are looking forward and we're looking into the COVID-19 recovery responses, to end child poverty during and post the pandemic, what we need are integrated and sustainable solutions. I think one speaker said that we need local oriented, locally developed solutions, and we have experience on the following programmatic approaches that we have seen working in most of our programs in Africa. So the savings groups is one of them, because they provide a local safety net for those in hard to reach places, pooling resources to fund their livelihood opportunities. And we have also established adolescent savings groups for child protection. For example, in Sierra Leone, what we did during the Ebola outbreak and during the 9 months of closure was to establish adolescent savings groups to teach them about financial literacy, about life skills training during that period when they're at home. So it's actually an opportunity, for us to utilize this as we're moving forward to actually scale up savings groups and be part of the government's policy response. In terms of microfinance, I think what's needed now, because I've highlighted that most of the small medium business enterprises, in particular women who are in informal trading, have lost their income. Some have sold their livelihood assets. So it's actually important and key that small loans are provided to finance livelihood opportunities, and where microfinance institutions or banks have actually loaned them money, to extend the repayment periods in order to boost their livelihoods. And cash and voucher assistance, I think, is key. It has been highlighted again, I think, by some of the previous speakers in terms of how are we, using the cash and voucher assistance to support those who are in the hard to reach areas, in order to reduce their exposure to negative coping mechanisms and help them to meet the immediate household needs. How do we use this as an approach to reduce risk to sell off livelihood assets? And how can we integrate skills training and livelihoods opportunities to lift families out of poverty and support those who are involved in smallholder agriculture? I think about 80%, in Africa, they rely on agriculture for income, for employment. So how can we use the cash and voucher assistance to support with agricultural inputs to boost agricultural productivity? And why am I saying this? Because these are the things that we have seen really working, a combination of savings group, of microfinance, of cash and voucher assistance, and livelihood training. In the Ebola crisis, World Vision actually supported over 42,000 small traders, almost 80% of whom are women, to kickstart their businesses by providing small loans and grants to help members pool resources and fund their businesses. And through a combination of targeted cash transfers and financial literacy training, we established and supported over 300 groups with over 10,500 members. And this was an opportunity for us as well to establish the first adolescent saving group, which became a platform for children to save and learn about child protection issues during the lockdown period. And there is a project that was funded by USAID in Sierra Leone, and a research was done by the University of Illinois, which actually found out how the members of these groups used the earnings from the loans. It showed that 81% of beneficiaries used the funds to pay school fees and buy learning materials for their children. 60% used the funds for medical expenses, and the majority of these loans provided for the basic needs of more than 40,000 children at a time when basic incomes were severely limited. Can I go to my last slide as I conclude? What do we need to do as we look into the future, the COVID-19 recovery strategies, and for us to be able to accelerate progress towards the implementation of the post-2030 agenda and actually protect the gains that have been made so far? So as we look at recovery strategies to end child poverty in Africa and reduce household inequalities, we are actually calling for 3 key recommendations. The first one is urgently scaling up child-sensitive social protection measures, such as food, cash, and voucher assistance to help poor families meet immediate food, nutrition, and incomes of their children. And where school closures limit children's access to school meals programs, we need to develop innovative ways to ensure that those children continue to access food through such means as delivery food to homes. And by doing so, we're actually protecting children's rights. We are reducing their exposure to different forms of violence, of exploitation and abuse, such as begging, child marriage, and child labor, and the likelihood that they will drop out of school post the crisis. Secondly, we need to protect jobs and livelihoods. As I've said, that the majority of people work in the informal sector. They're small and medium business enterprises. So in order to prevent job losses and allow for fast economic recovery, we also need to ensure that debt financing allows for flexible repayments, for grace periods, and ensure timely delivery to those who are mostly in need. And similarly, we need to provide technical assistance and coaching to the small, medium business enterprises in order to help them adapt their operations to keep workers and customers safe and respond to the changing markets. And lastly, as I've alluded earlier, that some of the challenges that we face in Africa are actually climate change related. And we're saying that we are facing a tripartite challenge in some contexts, conflict, climate change, flooding, locusts, and then COVID-19 comes to hit on top. So how do we ensure that we are investing in interventions that promote a green recovery? So since in most fragile contexts in Africa, climate change is a challenge, I think it's critical to develop economic recovery strategies or interventions that integrate resilience to climate change and restore environmental assets, which are central to food security, safety nets, and natural resource-based livelihoods. And this actually includes large-scale actions to decarbonize economies and restore degraded landscapes, as well as more localized climate change adaptation and risk reduction measures. And by doing so, I believe that this can reduce community exposure and vulnerability to climate-related hazards that disrupt and destroy livelihoods and local economies. So what is needed in Africa right now to respond to COVID-19 is the systemic, holistic, and integrated approaches to economic recovery on top of the other suggestions that look at the health systems and that looks at the education systems. How do we link and carry along the lessons from our experience during this pandemic and shape our education systems, shape our policies, and shape the interventions and how the government can actually deliver services to the most vulnerable communities and their children. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.